Well, hey everybody, I'm here in the middle of a forest in central Oregon near a place called Little Sweden. And that actually inspired today's video as I am thinking about how here in America we have always liked to bring over a lot of little aspects of Sweden into our culture. And I wanted to talk about one aspect of Sweden in particular that we might consider bringing over. Here in the States, we have had a lot of conversations lately about the weapons that we've provided to Ukraine for their fight against Russia. And in particular, one of the conversations that has been going on a lot lately between Ukraine and the States is whether or not Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons, American weapons, to strike Russian military targets on Russian territory. Now, at this point, at the time of making this video, this is something that we have not allowed Ukraine to do for a variety of reasons. But there is one Western nation who has allowed Ukraine to do this, and this is Sweden. What's interesting about this is that here in the States, the reason we often provide to Ukraine for not allowing them to use our weapons against targets on Russian territory is that we don't want to provoke a broader war with Russia because we're afraid of the consequences. But what's interesting about that is if you think about geographically where the United States sits, we are super far from Russia. I know technically Alaska is really close to Russia, but generally speaking, our population centers are super far from Russia and really out of range of any potential Russian retaliation. But one nation that is not very far from Russia at all is Sweden. Sweden shares the Baltic Sea with Russia. Sweden sits within missile range of Russia, within air force range of Russia. And yet Sweden, when they have looked at the same battlefield scenario as us, has made a different decision than the States, where they have actually done the same calculus as us, and they've decided it is in their best interests to allow Ukraine to use their weapons to strike Russian military targets on Russian territory. So the question that I've been really pondering today is, why is the United States being so slow to give Ukraine this permission when other nations like Sweden, the nations that are actually, potentially at threat if Russia decides to open up a broader war, don't share our same fears? Now, that's a really good question, but let's first talk about the importance of this decision. And I want to do that using actually these burn piles that are sitting behind me. I don't know if you can see them or not, but here in the middle of this Oregon forest, behind me there are a bunch of burn piles. And what these basically are is foliage from the floor of the forest that the Forest Service has come in before they have to worry about a fire. And they've actually gathered this all up, and they're going to burn all of that so that if a fire ever comes through here, there's not so much concentrated foliage that the fire doesn't get out of control, so that the Forest Service can manage any fire that blows through here. The reality is that for quite a while, Ukraine has been sitting in a position where they are at a disadvantage, not because of poor strategy, not because of poor tactics, and not because of poor execution, but because of politics, where Russian soldiers have been allowed to basically mass up right next to the Ukrainian border or within striking distance of the Ukrainian border, and Ukraine doesn't have long enough range weapons that they can use to effectively strike them, or they have them, but they don't have the permission to use them to strike them. For a long time, it's been the case where Russian soldiers have basically been allowed to mass up near the Ukrainian border and prepare to assault Ukrainian cities and actually basically prepare huge movements of troops to all move at once and attack Ukrainian cities. Whereas Ukraine has not been able to do the same thing against Russian targets. And the reason for that Russia has been able to mass up so much and then move like a gigantic wildfire pushing through the forest, is because Ukraine hasn't been allowed to gather up the small pieces before they become a problem. Ukraine has been able to see through drones and satellites and all sorts of other things these mass movements of Russian troops on Russian territory. But because the United States has been so slow to give Ukraine permission to use our weapons against military targets, valid military targets, Ukraine hasn't been able to do anything about this. Even more than that, there are a lot of airstrikes that for a long time were taking place against Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian military positions that were being launched from air bases that were well within range of weapons that we had provided to Ukraine that they could have used to stop these airstrikes by hitting these airfields and taking out these aircraft. But we chose not to do that for a variety of reasons. Now, because of that, these airplanes were able to launch with impunity and really wreak havoc on a lot of Ukrainian people. And since then, these airplanes that we could have hit and immobilized and taken out of action have now been moved to bases further away from the Ukrainian border so that Ukraine can no longer easily strike them. So in other words, there are a lot of people who have lost their lives and a lot of advantages that Ukraine has lost that they could have had because we've been slow to act on this particular issue. And the question is, why have we been so slow to act? When we look at countries like Sweden, who are actually in the firing line, who are demonstrating to the world that they are not afraid of Russian retaliation, even though Russian retaliation could actually reach them, what should that tell us here in the States as we think about the permission that we should or should not give to Ukraine? I think it's very telling that when you look at nations, not just Sweden, but also Finland and the Baltic states, all the countries that are close to Russia, they don't fear Russian retaliation to the same degree Americans do, despite the fact that Americans are so far away from Russia. It's just something interesting to think through. And the question is, how fast do you think Ukraine could win the war if they were given permission to use their weapons to the same degree that Russia uses their weapons with impunity? I have a little bit more to say, but it's getting a little bit too dark for filming. So we'll end it here. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.